And we're live. It is Thursday, the 30th day of October, the year of our Lord 2025. It is 8 o'clock a.m. And, this is the second day of our Halloween horror movie extravaganza. And this is the day that you get to find out, if you didn't already have a sense of it, just how much of a nerd your co-host Michael Feinberg actually is. Because we are diving deep into a movie that most of you have never heard of. I had never heard of. I've never watched. And we're going to do it unapologetically. And some of you are going to get like 15 minutes into this and say, like, okay, this show is not for me today. And you're going to drop off. But the five of you who remain by the end of the show, we're, are the true fanatics. Um, Folks, I have a couple of announcements to make. The first is that the last day of our Halloween extravaganza will be tomorrow on Halloween proper, and it will culminate, one might even say, with my telling the story of how I traumatized neighborhood children over a long period of time with my Halloween costumes and why I no longer wear Halloween costumes. Um, that'll be tomorrow. Uh, Reminder that we have the next
You hear me?
installment of the Make America Read Again book club on Sunday at 6 p.m. We will be live from Politics and Prose. And I have a message to the good folks at Politics and Prose. Do not, again, in the future, deny my people book events. Anytime I hear that my friends are not getting book events at Politics and Prose, we are going to do a live Mara book club from Politics and Prose. There's going to be a book event at Politics and Prose whether you want there to be or not. And so you may as well come in with, just, do it voluntarily, cooperate, because, you know, it's going to happen. That'll be at 6 o'clock on Sunday. There may be, and there may not be, we are still working on this, a event on Sunday morning on this for this community. Not sure about this. I'm still working to see if we can put it together, but we were thinking of having a benefit fundraising concert with Valeria Vovk and her crew. See the post from the other day. And we were going to do a virtual. I tried to get the NPR Tiny Desk people, concert people, to do a concert with them. So far, I have been ghosted by NPR, and I want to say, guys, my revenge will be swift and terrible. I'm not sure. I don't appreciate being ghosted. And so, particularly not when I'm trying to help, struggling musicians bring to the public's attention music that, the Soviets and the Putinists killed to suppress. Well, I expect answers to my emails when I do that sort of shit. Politics and Prose, NPR, you're both on my shit list today. But on the theory that, 6 p.m. at Politics and Prose against their will, I don't actually need NPR to do a Tiny Desk concert. And so the question is when we are going to do this and whether we're going to try to squeeze it in before some of these crew have to go back to Ukraine on Sunday, or whether we're going to do it in smaller forces later. Stay tuned on that. I will be I will making an announcement about that as soon as we have it scheduled. Um, Again, 6 o'clock p.m. Sunday. Holly Berkeley Fletcher, the Missionary Kids, and Barbara Kingsolver, the Poisonwood Bible. I have learned more about evangelical missionaries in in Africa than in the last few weeks than I ever thought I would know. Um, but before that, part two of it, we might call it Halloween 2, The Possession, with Mike Feinberg and Charlie Crane. Guys, the floor is yours. I'm going to shut up and join the Greek chorus.
All right. So, Charlie, you got me?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah. All right. So, this is a weird film to talk about. You texted me last night while you were rewatching it and said you'd forgotten that it ends with World War III starting because that is one of the least crazy things that happens in the film. So, I want to get to Possession in a sort of backwards way by talking about a different horror movie, different horror movies and a different horror movie trope. And that is this sort of meta genre in a horror film or a horror novel or TV show where the protagonists are seeking a sort of lost artifact, whether it's a book, a movie, a videotape, that inevitably drives them insane and causes horror. You know, we see this in the film The Ring. We see it in the John Carpenter episode of Masters of Horror, Cigarette Burns, where the protagonist is trying to track down a film of an angel being tortured that drives everybody to homicidal mania. Like I said, The Ring, both the Japanese and English iterations. There's a show on Shudder called Dead Wax where they're trying to get a vinyl record that causes homicidal mania. David Foster Wallace uses this even in Infinite Jest. And when I watched Possession, what I kept thinking was if the audience ever saw the film that was driving people insane and causing homicidal mania in any of these other movies, Possession would probably be what it is. This is an incredibly odd film, and I think it's a really good way to sort of talk about what happens when an auteur or an art house director leans heavily into genre tropes. So I wanted to sort of, I don't know how to even begin talking about this movie because it is so absolutely insane.
Well, Mike, it's really a
So
story about marriage.
yes, I'm gonna ask you a question with a hat tip to Raymond Carver. What are we talking about when we talk about the film Possession?
Well, I kind of clocked in last night that the wife's name is Anna, which I think is appropriate because this is certainly an unhappy family that's unhappy in its own way. Um, and
Should we start with a plot summary
well, let,
for
let me
those who
take a
haven't
crack at
seen it?
this, at least at kind of setting
Okay.
it up. So the movie begins with Sam Neill, who plays a husband and father, returning from a business trip. And as he's getting out of the cab and getting his bags out of the cab, he and his wife are continuing an argument that has started before the movie even began. And essentially, the setup is he's been away on business, and we find out that he's involved in some way in espionage. I mean, I think apparently for a private organization, but I don't really know.
He's been
And
traveling into East Berlin,
right.
apparently. Yeah.
And so he returns, and she has already told him and repeats to him when he gets home that it's over. And he wants to know why and if it's possible to save the marriage and what they're going to do about their son. And she can't really tell him anything except repeating over and over again that it's over, and she can't really say why. Um, and I guess the first half of the movie is this incredibly intense drama about this marriage that has apparently already fallen apart, and Sam Neill's character being driven to this emotional extreme by the fact that his wife can't explain to him why, and the wife being driven to an emotional extreme by the fact that Sam Neill can't accept that she can't explain why. And then um And then I would say maybe like 50 minutes or an hour into a 2 hour movie, at that point you could say this is just a very intense drama. But then I don't know. Do we? I guess should we just say that if you haven't seen Possession,
let's go with spoilers because
yeah,
there's no other way to
if you
talk about
haven't
this
seen
film.
Possession, you should see Possession. What we eventually
We're going to
learn,
do spoilers today.
yeah,
Yeah,
Again,
just feel free.
from the point about from the point of yesterday, if you've gotten this far in your life without seeing it as I have, and you're choosing to watch this show, you are choosing to make to ruin the film for yourself.
Yeah,
And so that's a good time to shut it off if you want to. But
this is going to get
we're not
interesting. I
gonna
promise. This is a
tiptoe
weird enough. Yeah,
around the substance of the film.
yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I would recommend watching it before you learn much about it. But even if you, I could sit here and basically take you through scene by scene, and it would not actually prepare you for the experience of watching the movie. What eventually we come to learn is that the wife, for reasons that are never really explained, has birthed some sort of creature that she is hiding in an apartment and feels this need to take care of as if it's a child. And the husband's attempts to find out what's going on lead to several people being murdered, not by the creature, but by his wife, who feels this protection, this protective instinct towards this creature. And I mean, meanwhile, he has run into his son's primary school teacher, who inexplicably is a doppelganger of his wife, although he's the only one who seems to have noticed how strange this is. And eventually, at the end of the movie, we find out that this creature has morphed into a doppelganger of Sam Neill's character. And why this is happening and what it all means, I guess, is what we're about to talk about. But I think that that pretty much covers it, except for the fact that the espionage element is introduced in the first 10 minutes, completely dropped. And then in the last 10 minutes, his handlers kind of come around and say, hey, we have to get you back in to the game, which he doesn't want to do because obviously he's got some stuff going on in his personal life. And it kind of becomes this strange climax where you've got the climax to the psychological and body horror story and this espionage story, which ends apparently with the beginning of World War III as you hear, the planes and the missiles starting to shriek overhead.
No, this is interesting because I had a totally different interpretation and understanding of what happens in the second half of the film.
Oh, okay.
I did not take it that she gave birth to the creature she was protecting. I took it that there's the horrifying scene where Sam Neill walks in on his wife making love to this Cthulhu-like tentacled creature. What I took to happen is that she was impregnated by the creature and aborted in the famous subway scene, which won her the Best Actress at Cannes for this film. She miscarries the creature and is having an affair with the Cthulhu-like monster, and the Cthulhu-like monster eventually turns into Sam Neill's doppelganger.
I don't know if you broke up or if it was just my connection, but so you think that that she has an affair with the creature impregnates her and she miscarries?
Yeah, during the subway scene.
Okay.
All right, I don't want to. We're not going to solve this because
yeah,
this movie is just batshit.
Yeah, I'll just take a step back and say that I think that there are movies where it's really valuable to, try to get a handle on exactly what's going on. And then there are movies where
But I want
it's
to
the
get a
experience.
handle on something else, which is
Yeah,
what is this a metaphor for? Like,
Right.
presumably, I don't know if you guys have ever seen the movie How to Get Ahead in Advertising.
of course, with
Um,
Richard Grant.
yeah, which is quite
Yeah,
quite quite wonderful.
Yeah.
But I watched it with a clinical psychologist who had all these theories about what it was about, and my reaction to it was, well, it's about a guy with a mole on his neck that turns into a separate head and beats him into, like I took it very literally, as a sort of comic horror movie, but uh, but but you can also see it as metaphorical for, you know, multiple personalities or
Mhm.
so. And so my question is like, what is this standing for? Is it people hiding things in marriages? Is it people's secrets? What is at a different level in the sense that
Yeah.
what is it really about?
So if you dive into the criticism of this film, and I think we should add, because the way we've been describing it, it sounds very much like a low budget B movie. This was a high value production. It was entered at Cannes. It won multiple awards in Europe. And then for the American market, it was cut by something like 50 minutes and just didn't work. And it was only rediscovered a few years ago when it was re released. But like, we're talking about a legitimate film here. This isn't I Spit on Your Grave. And if you read the criticism, the director is very adamant that making this film was a representation of and a way of obtaining catharsis for his own brutal divorce, which he was going through at the time. And one really common, almost Jungian interpretation is that the creature which Isabel Ondaatje ends up having the affair with and or birthing is a sort of physical manifestation of her psyche as the marriage is falling apart. And I also think that there's an implied occurrence where the school teacher of their son, who Sam Neill ends up falling in love with, who looks exactly like his wife, is also the creation of a doppelganger from Sam Neill's psychosis. And at the end of the film, the psychosis is all that's left. The two original humans have died, and the two doppelgangers are gathered in the apartment as World War III is starting.
So,
Um,
do you
so,
mind if
so I
I?
think what this is, it's a very like David Lynchian. Um, it's more, if we're talking about it in musical terms, this isn't a symphony with four movements. This is a tone poem. I don't know that we can impose a straightforward narrative or interpretation on it. I just know, to sort of get back to what I was saying yesterday, this movie made me uncomfortable and terrified in a way few movies have.
So I think that, I mean, just to Mike's point about this being a legitimate movie. I mean, first of all, I think that a lot of kind of sleazy B movies can also be legitimate movies, but I think that if you watch the movie again for the first hour, what you're watching is a movie that does what like good film does, which is kind of use the empathy that you can create to kind of get you into the emotional situation that the characters are in. And the performances are really amazing. Isabella Gianni, I think, gets more credit than Sam Neill because she has the striking scene in the subway. But it's just two characters who are just at this emotional extreme because there's this kind of unsolvable problem in their relationship. And so, like, what is the movie about? I mean, it is, I think, about a relationship falling apart, kind of in the same way that there's a David Cronenberg movie from the 70s called The Brood, which is also a horror movie, which is inspired by his divorce. Also a body horror movie inspired by his divorce. And I think that, again, if you kind of set aside, like, well, wait a minute, on a kind of mechanical level, what is happening and exactly why, and how do you make rational sense of it? I mean, it's a movie where you're set into the middle of a fight between a husband and a wife, where the wife is adamant that the relationship is over and can't explain why. and the husband is adamant that he's not going to accept that. The husband runs into a woman that he perceives to be a kind of idealized, younger, more maternal version of his wife who has left him. And at the end of the movie, we come to discover that what has caused the wife to leave the husband is that she has gotten involved in some way with a monster, which eventually turns into what looks like a kind of creepy, but also a kind of idealized version of her husband. And so, I mean, I think what you would say it's about on that level is it's about your marriage is falling apart. It's falling apart for crazy reasons that neither person can really understand. And both people are desperate to find somebody who is what they had hoped their partner was when they got into the relationship in the first place. And I mean, I think,
Interesting.
again,
And
like,
so, so why is horror a good vehicle for that? Because usually, if you think about like a marriage falling apart because of a crazy thing that's happening, and you you wouldn't think of that as a horror movie instinctively. You'd think of it as a drama, a kind of
I totally disagree actually. If you put yourself we're all married or in long-term relationships now, but put yourself in your headspace when you were a teenager or in your 20s or whenever, and you had a really bad breakup of some sort. I can speak for myself that at least like a lot of the emotional tumult that results from that can take the form of insecurity and fear. And as a result, drama is the most straightforward way of portraying it. But if you're trying to cut to the most basic emotional level, um, horror tropes offer you a really good way of visualizing those things that I don't think other genres do. And, we'll get more into this tomorrow when we talk about the Oz Perkins film, but there was this whole movement that started about a decade and a half ago called elevated horror, which is basically traditional B movie storylines made with incredibly high production values for a mainstream audience that are almost inevitably all metaphors for familial and relationship grief. We see this in Hereditary. We see it in Midsummer. We see it in The Witch. I think horror, there's two reasons I really love it, but one of the reasons is it allows you to visually manifest emotions in a way that would not be acceptable in any other genre, except maybe extreme comedy. There's an unreality to it that allows you to get away with more.
yeah, and I think I mean, I'm trying to think about when you asked yesterday, like, how do I define horror and kind of try to think of it in that framework, I guess. I mean, if I kind of think of horror as kind of, like supernatural horror being the idea that objectively, like the universe is malevolent, and is bad and out to get you. And then other kind of genres or subgenres within horror, which kind of try to recreate that basic sense without necessarily having a supernatural element. I think that, I mean, I guess I'm basically agreeing with Mike that I think what this movie does is say, we've all been in, or I think most people have been in, like Mike said, a relationship that ended really badly. Whether, even if it's not a romantic relationship, just a fraught relationship with somebody that you're very close to. And then what happens when that falls apart? How does that make you feel? What does that make you think about whether your life has any meaning, whether there's any use to going on in the world, whether the world is a good place? And I think that, again, like for the first hour of this movie, I mean, it starts off at a very high level of emotion and then just kind of ratchets up from there for the first hour. And you're just watching people having incredibly intense, not only arguments with each other, but I mean, you see Sam Neill by himself essentially kind of going off and kind of, it just cuts to him kind of at the end of a 3 week bender where he's lying on the bed shivering and tries to make a phone call and can't talk, and then has to kind of clean himself up and act normal and go back and try to be a father to his son. And you get that sort of thing for about an hour. And then I think like maybe at around the point where the movie has nowhere else to go in terms of ratcheting up the kind of non supernatural, non horror emotion, it crosses over into this other realm where you're just getting this physical manifestation of, you know, the emotion, and not just supernatural, but also with like, I don't think the monster ever kills anyone. It's all the people kill
No,
people.
it's all individuals associated with the monster trying to cover up the monster's
Yeah.
existence.
And I
All
think
right, so
kind of just
this
quickly to
actually brings
relate
up.
it back to
Oh,
The
sorry. Go
Exorcist.
ahead.
I mean, I think that The Exorcist is more of a traditional horror movie, obviously, in that there is the kind of supernatural battle between good and evil. But in some ways, it's similar in that it just kind of takes these relationship questions of how does it feel to have a sick child that you can't help? You know, how does it feel to have a parent who's elderly and you have chosen to have a job where you can't make enough money to support them and they have to be in kind of the public hospital and you aren't there when they die? Like, how does that feel? And then it gets ratcheted up to this supernatural level of like, what if your mother goes to hell because of that? What if your child gets destroyed by a demon because you weren't able to figure out how to help them?
Yeah, so this brings me to a class of horror movies, of which I think the most famous one recently is Get Out, where they don't start as horror movies, right? And the supernatural element or the horror element gets introduced kind of only midway through the film, right? And it starts as, go visit the girlfriend's family and they seem very nice and there's something a little bit weird about the place, but okay, and then only as you progress does it turn out that they are, harvesting people's brains, um, or bodies. Um, and there's a there's a very highbrow version of this in Ishiguro's novel and then film
Never Let Me
Never Let
Go.
Me Go,
Yeah.
right? Which is an interesting question whether that's a horror movie, or not. But in my experience, these movies weirdly tend to involve organ harvesting,
Mhm.
um, like that there's some use of your body or brain or organs, and that the thing kind of creeps up on you. You think it's just about kids at a boarding school, and it's kind of like Hogwarts, only it's weird. And then there's organ harvesting, right? And or it's visiting the girlfriend's family, and then only kind of midway through do you realize it's white people harvesting black people's bodies. Um, and I'm wondering, is this film the urtext of that? That you have to get well into it before you even know it's a horror movie as opposed to a drama about marriage.
So I think Charlie and I have discussed this in a different context before. What you're describing, I don't think is a subgenre. I think it's just really good writing. And we've talked about this in the context of Stephen King novels, which began publishing well before Possession. And Stephen King is not objectively a good stylist. He's not a particularly good prose writer, but his books are, to use a fake word, unputdownable. And I think part of the reason is he does a really good job at the outset of taking middle American slice of life characters and walking you through their day to day existence, sometimes at what may seem like a very leisurely pace, and just getting you to care about them. And once you care about them, he then puts them through hell, and you're more and more emotionally vested than you would have been if the vampire or the ghost or the poltergeist or whatever showed up on page one.
I don't
You were
think this is
skeptical.
right. All right, let us take the classic horror movies.
Mm-hmm.
Um, my favorite horror movie of all time,
Invasion of
uh,
the Body Snatchers.
Invasion of the Body
Yeah.
Snatchers. The Body Snatchers show up right at the beginning. It's not, there's no, they're not hanging out. Um, you know, um,
Are
I
we're talking about the 1950s iteration,
Yes,
right? Okay.
right. We're not talking about, I can't think of a movie that predates what you're describing, that in which you go a long time before realizing that this is a horror movie. That, the catch doesn't happen quite early. Um, and now it seems to me that this is a proliferating form, um, and that the idea that we're going to lull you into the idea that this is a movie about X, and then there is a pivot point like 45 minutes in where, oh, this is the organ harvesting movie.
Well,
um,
it might not be a trope in film per se, but it certainly existed in the genre for a long time. You mentioned Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Roughly contemporaneous with that is Rod Serling's original run of The Twilight Zone. And The Twilight Zone, you can really divide into three types of episodes. You have the sort of humanistic fables, which people tend to forget about because they're generally feel good, which is not something you associate with The Twilight Zone. You have sci fi, and then you have the classic horror episodes. And in the horror episodes, the twist, the realization of what's actually happening, doesn't happen until the last 3 or 4 minutes after you've already seen all these ordinary people going through what seem like just regular weird life struggles that in the very last minute tend to have an outside force sort of pulling the strings.
Well, I'm trying to think
what
of
do
an
you think,
example of,
Charlie? Who's right here?
well,
Settle this argument.
so I was trying to, I think that the distinction that you're kind of talking about is that I was trying to think of a good example from Stephen King. And I think that the difference maybe between what Ben you're talking about and what Mike is talking about is that even in a Stephen King novel where it takes a while for the truly kind of horrific or supernatural stuff to get rolling, um, like Pet Cemetery is an example of this. The true kind of, I don't know, it's been a really long time since I read the book, but it takes a while for you even to get to the point where you realize, oh yeah, this cemetery can bring pets back to life. And then it's a much longer time after that before the question of, well, what happens if you try it with the person comes up. But I think it's established very early in the novel through some dreams that the main character has and through some other kind of uncanny experiences that this is not just a story about a doctor who moves to rural Maine to kind of start a, job at a university health center. Um, the movie that sprung to mind when I was trying to think, like, what is a movie that just does not tip its hand for a while at all, that seems to be another genre? Actually, two came up. One is After Possession, that's Predator, which, with the exception of an opening scene that the director did not want in the movie, that was forced on him by the studio, that shows a kind of spaceship arriving on Earth. You get maybe 45 minutes into that movie, and it's just an action movie about some commandos going in and kind of wreaking havoc on communist guerrillas in Central America. Um, but the movie that I thought of as an older movie, which starts off as one kind of movie and then pivots into something else, is Psycho, which starts off as a movie about a woman who seems like a pretty good person, but makes this terrible mistake in stealing this money and leaves town and, has a conversation with the innkeeper. And, as a result of that conversation, she kind of decides, you know what, I need to go back and kind of make things right. And then at that point, mother shows up in the shower and she gets stabbed to death, and it turns into, I mean, I would call it a horror movie, but it at least turns into a much different movie than
Proto
we
slasher.
thought that it was going to be. Um, and so,
We can even go back further than that, though, Charlie. I mean, look at Jacques Tournier's Cat People, which is one of the most famous 1950s horror films. And, for the first 45 minutes or so, that's just about a young woman's psychosis and her inability to get close to other human beings. It's not until well into the film that you realize that's because when she becomes sexually aroused, she literally turns into a man-eating cat of some sort.
Yeah, and I suppose there's also this would be later than Possession, but there's also the reverse horror movie where you really don't find out what it's about until the very end. I'm thinking of the Mickey Rourke, Halle Berry movie with
Angel Heart.
Angel Heart with Robert De Niro.
Lisa Bonet.
Elisa Monet, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, Bonet, which is a private detective procedural the
Mhm.
entire way until the very end when you find out that the private detective is actually, well, that the client is the devil,
Mhm.
literally the devil,
Louis Cypher, which,
Louis
yeah.
Cypher, played by Robert De Niro, and
Yeah.
that the detective is in fact looking for himself
Mhm.
because he is a uh, somebody who sold his soul for continued life
Mhm.
years ago, and has been recreated in furtherance of that.
Mhm.
Um, and I've always had mixed feelings about this movie because the actual film, it's a completely brilliantly filmed and wonderfully acted. I mean, the young Mickey Rourke
Yeah.
is spectacular, and Lisa Bonet is terrific, and I mean, it's just a wonderfully done movie that then has this kind of, I feel like the end is sort of deranged and cheap, and you know like changes the entire premise of the story, um and um and doesn't make a lot of sense. But then again, I'm not like it like I sort of feel like you just can't spring a supernatural thing on me.
But
You
but
have to set it up.
do you think Angel Heart actually springs that? I mean, throughout the entire film, there are allusions and explicit plot references to voodoo practices in New Orleans. So they very subtly introduce supernatural elements to the film, but you don't realize why. I feel like they're setting the audience up to accept something supernatural. It's just not what you think it's going to be.
Well,
I
in
think,
retrospect, yes, but I have to say the first time I saw that movie, I felt very cheated.
Okay.
Um, Sorry, Charlie, I
oh
interrupted
no,
you.
I think that I love Angel Heart, and I love the ending of
I
Angel
think
Heart.
we saw that like when we saw that when we were like 13 together or something insane,
Well, we
right?
were a little older than that, but I think we watched it in high school. And I think it's a movie
Okay.
that I know that it's a movie that my dad also loves. I don't remember if he had already seen it or if I watched it with him for the first time. But I think that for me, I mean, I'm just thinking about Ben, your criticism, and I trying to figure out why don't I have the same concern? And I think that for me, it's that even if you don't, for me, like even as I watched the movie, not necessarily knowing how it was going to end, not only are there kind of allusions to voodoo practice, but it's very clear that Mickey Rourke's character is troubled and that he's troubled because of things that happened to him in his past, and that, you know, he isn't necessarily coming to grips with those things. And so I guess for me, it kind of works psychologically because as he's investigating this, you kind of see that he's dealing with some personal stuff, which apparently at the start of the movie doesn't necessarily have any relationship to the case that he's investigating. And then in the end,
Right.
you kind of realize, oh, actually,
He's
the trouble
investigating
that he's having
himself.
has everything to do with the case that he's investigating. And there's a wonderful line at the end where Robert De Niro, as the devil, tells him, the flesh is weak and only the soul is eternal, and yours belongs to me. And it's kind of this, to me, that kind of brings together like, why has this guy been having so much trouble and what's going on with an investigation? And then the kind of
Right.
supernatural
And why
element.
can't he remember his past?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
And just the way
no,
that he kind
it's
of
a
is, he spends the last, like, he says at the end of the movie over and over again, like, I know who I am. I know who I am. I
know
know who
who
I
I
am.
am.
And it's just so kind of perfect as kind of his psychology and the horror kind of coming together.
Well, and I actually have spent a lot of time in the last few days meditating on Republican members of Congress who don't know who they are and who, and I have literally spent time thinking about him having been confronted by the devil, who says, you are the person that you're seeking on behalf of me. You are, you are, I forget the name of the singer. You and he's sitting there like I know who I am. I know who I am, and he's convinced that he did not kill any of these people, and yet he knows that he did. And this is, you know, Tom Cotton at night. I know who I am. I am. You know, and you're like, no, actually, you have about as much sense of who you are as Mickey Rourke at the end of Angel Heart.
Mm-hmm.
No, Angel Heart is a truly wonderful movie. I don't know if it's a horror movie or if it's a detective film or if it's a super. I don't know what it is genre wise. I did feel cheated by the writers at the end the first two times I saw it. And I had to kind of learn to love that ending over time. Uh,
And it's got one of the great final shots of any horror movie, with him on the elevator literally descending to hell, where he is presumably going to spend eternity.
Mm-hmm.
right.
And
And
there are
and
some,
also the idea that that elevator is an industrial elevator
Yep.
going into some, I mean, the whole thing is just beautifully, beautifully filmed and imagined. And I remember watching it with my dad, who's a medical doctor, and um, it takes place in the 50s. And my dad noticed that there's a scene in which one of the characters is a morphine addict, and he's a doctor, and that the syringes that he uses are not plastic syringes of the type that we use now, but they're glass syringes which are reusable, and they're in an autoclave, which is actually how they would have been cleaned. And so it's somebody spent just a huge amount of time in that movie getting little details right. And it's a really amazing film. So let me ask you about some other filmmakers that are doing something similar to this. That is, they're making something like art films
Mhm.
that are either part of this genre or deeply influenced by this genre. And so um, one of them is David Cronenberg, who starts as a just a B or C movie horror director and then gets increasingly complicated and like I mean I've ends up making I, I think Dead Ringers is the scariest movie I've ever seen. And I saw it when I was a freshman in college with two friends, one male and one female. And when it was over, none of the three of us had any idea what it was about when we walked in. and, um, and what it is about, for those of you who've never seen it, is identical twin gynecologists played by Jeremy Irons.
Who is
Um,
the creepiest man alive, by the
who,
way.
yes,
Yeah.
who is the cool and
If you
milks
thought
it
he
for
was
everything
creepy as
it's
Klaus
worth.
von Bülow, wait till you see this.
Right.
Yeah.
Who go insane together. Um,
And based on a true story.
in a right
Yeah.
in a florid drug induced haze and end up dismembering each other and uh and it is a picture of their joint psychological decline. And I remember the film ending and the lights come up and Elizabeth said to David and me, if either of you liked that movie, please do not tell me because I could never be friends with anybody who liked that movie.
So I mean, I think Charlie and we've taught, the way that this 3-day sprint of horror movies started is Charlie and I have something we call Satanic Sundays, where every Sunday we watch the same horror movie or two and discuss it. And we've done a couple of Cronenberg films. I mean, we love Cronenberg. And, there was Amazon did a remake of Dead Ringers as a miniseries where they changed the gender of the gynecologists.
Well, that kind of makes it less creepy right
Well,
there.
well, except what I don't know because it came out while my wife was pregnant, and my parents, who also really like Cronenberg, which is weird because we rarely agree on films, told me that I should definitely watch the remake, but absolutely not while my wife was pregnant. Maybe put it off for a little while, and I just haven't gotten to it yet. But it's supposed to be good.
Interesting.
I mean, I think
Have you watched
Cronenberg,
it, Charlie?
this is a sad thing to admit. I have actually not seen Dead Ringers. It's kind of a gap in my Cronenberg, knowledge, which now that I've said this out loud, I think I need to remedy, very soon. But
It,
I mean, I think
it
that
is a
Cronenberg is,
genuinely horrifying movie.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that what Cronenberg is so amazing at, I mentioned, I think, The Brood, and he has another movie from the 70s called Rabid, which is about, well, you just watch Rabid. But this way of using body horror to kind of manifest things that are, going on in the characters' heads, whether it's something where it manifests as something genuinely kind of inexplicable or supernatural, like in, The Brood or Rabid, or something like Dead Ringers, which is, not supernatural. It's just watching the psychology of these men. I mean, I think The Fly by David Cronenberg is another great example of a movie that gets you invested because it creates this great relationship between Gina Davis and Jeff Goldblum. But the seeds of what's going to destroy that are there at the beginning too, in terms of Jeff Goldblum's kind of self-assurance and his desire, well, his outward self-assurance and his internal kind of insecurity and desire to kind of prove that he's as great as he says he is, and then, I think that Cronenberg is just so good at not just making movies which are disturbing to watch because there's kind of creepy or unpleasant stuff on the screen, but it kind of is a metaphor for what's going on in the characters' heads.
Right. And you see that in and one of the things about Cronenberg that is not true about a lot of, you know, horror movie directors is that he, you know, the greatest actors in the world want to work with him, you know,
Mhm.
whether it's Jeremy Irons or Jennifer Jason Leigh, right? I mean, he has like he is thought of as a director's director. Not he's not. I mean, yes, it's genre stuff, but the interesting one of the interesting things about Cronenberg is how meticulous that filmmaking is as filmmaking, and let's talk about the the spectrum of that for a minute because you started this with Possession, which is, you know, you pointed out is a Cannes Award
Yeah,
film,
it's
right?
it's yeah, it's incredibly difficult to parse.
Right. It's this is among other things, you know, Isabella Johnny and Sam Neill, right? This is a hell of a cast. Um, and then we've talked about, you know, Angel Heart and David Cronenberg. These are like big deal. I don't
Yeah,
remember who directed Angel Heart. Um,
Alan Parker.
but
Alan Parker. Yeah,
okay. Um, but when most people think of horror movies, they think of one slasher movies and two kind of zombie films, the sort
Mhm.
of George Romero, who is also, by the way, a really interesting character.
Yeah.
And so, what is the relationship between the the sort of high art uh, filmmaker horror movie and the sort of three guys and a bucket of blood,
So,
you know, in a graveyard, splashing things on something. Um, you know,
I
there's
don't.
a relationship there, and it's not
Yeah,
a trivial one.
I So I think one thing that we can take from sort of film history is that horror has traditionally been sort of like a farm team genre for people who would really go on to more serious films. You know, I think of like Roger Corman's stable. When you think of the people who helped out on like Roger Corman films, which I love but are not objectively good, you have Francis Ford Coppola as a production assistant as one of his first jobs. You have Jack Nicholson making his first acting appearances. You have Scorsese starting out as a PA for Corman. You know, there's really like, because it can be done on a low budget and has, I think low budget horror films, I think generally make back their investments than other low budget films. And as a result, like they're always going on, so a lot of people who are trying to break into film get their start there. And you know, I don't know. I have a hard
The
time
most
really
famous
doing the
modern
hard.
example being the Blair Witch Project.
Yeah.
What's that?
The most famous
Yeah.
modern example being the Blair Witch
Yeah, that
Project,
was
which,
made for what, like
yeah,
$10,000
I
or
think it was
something?
like
And
ten or
yeah,
twenty
Yeah.
thousand dollars or something by you know, a young woman with no prior filmmaking experience. I mean, you can't just break into major film that way any in a lot of other genres.
correct. And the best, and you know, horror, it's easier because, you know, as Steven Spielberg probably demonstrated best in Jaws, like a lot of the best horror movies don't actually show you anything for most of the film. Like it's the power of suggestion that actually makes them scary. So you don't need a high budget except for maybe one scene. And even the Blair Witch, you know, the Blair Witch Project's most terrifying scene is just a guy standing in the corner of a basement at the end. It's an easy way for people to break into the industry and make a mark that they really can't in other genres.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that I think that it's kind of like with any kind of movie or any genre of movie, it just comes down to what's the point of this story? What story are you telling? And, how are you telling it? And I mean, there are horror movies that I like, or at least have a good time watching that I couldn't really defend as having any, deeper meaning or whatever. Like I like Friday the 13th Part 4. Um, Great gore effects, some fun performances, some great set pieces. I'm not going to even waste time trying to defend it as a movie that's really worth discussing much. But you take a movie like the
I did
Texas.
spend the afternoon, Charlie. I did spend the afternoon of my wedding watching Jason Takes Manhattan.
Oh, as one should. Um,
Yeah,
but take a movie like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which I think a lot of people would who haven't seen it might lump in with a movie like Friday the 13th. And it's a combination of what you can do with a low budget or no budget and the imagination to really go for it and to kind of take a very kind of straightforward story and turn it into something, through how you tell the story that kind of gets into this kind of almost like possession. You kind of follow these characters. It's a story that tips its hand about what it's about much more quickly, like in the opening credits.
probably with the title.
But
Yeah.
but it's still a story where for a while you're just kind of following these characters and then you kind of watch them kind of turn down the wrong road and go to the wrong house and then end up in the kind of, nightmare version of rural America. And there's very little on-screen violence in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. You very, very rarely see anybody actually get wounded in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It's just the horror of the situation that the characters are in and the horror of the people that they run into. And I think that if you have a really strong idea for telling that kind of a story, you really don't need much of a budget to do it. Even if it's a horror movie, that
And of course,
like a supernatural.
Night of the original Night of the Living Dead falls into somewhat of the same category. I don't think there's, I mean, it's in black and white, there's a little bit of black blood in it, but mostly it's just, you know, mostly it's conceptual and, these they're slow zombies and you're surrounded in a house with a few live people and it's kind of a last stand movie. Um, but um, but I'm it's much less violent than a lot of subsequent zombie movies.
Mhm. And I
Yeah,
think that it
including the
really,
remake of Night of the Living Dead, which really leaned into the gore.
yeah. I mean, and I think that the reason that people remember Night of the Living Dead decades later is not because of the great zombie effects, although there are. I mean, what it's really this like when things fall apart, when society falls apart suddenly and for inexplicable reasons, who do you trust? And you're stuck with a bunch of
Right.
strangers. Who do you trust? Who's a real leader? Who's just bluffing? You know, what are you going to do? How are you going to decide how you're going to do it? It's I mean, I think that that's one of the kind of things that makes horror great.
We're going to leave it there, folks. We're going to be back tomorrow. It will actually be Halloween, and we will be here for Halloween 3. Alicia will be back. Mike, what are we going to be talking about?
We're going to be talking about a film called The Others, which is very different than the films we've talked about thus far, and that, like, there's nothing that makes you turn away from the screen, but it is one of the most genuinely scary films you will ever see, I think. And if we have time, we're going to talk about a new, not as well known, somewhat in my view, underrated director who Charlie and I love and who Alicia hates, and use that as a tool for figuring out what works in a horror movie.
And guys, are we going to be wearing costumes?
The only
Hmm.
costume I've got is not scary.
Um, I will be in costume, and I will also be in costume for Lawfare Live on Friday. And frankly, I will think less of you, Mike, if you do not at least
Yeah,
having goaded me into doing 3 days of Halloween coverage. If I am the
I
only
mean, look,
one wearing
I've
a
got a
costume,
costume, but
it's going to be an issue between us.
it is a
Look,
family costume based on Dr. Seuss. It's not particularly
you
smart.
know, there are skeleton masks at every CVS. I
I've
mean,
got there's a
I have
Leatherface
confidence in you,
lantern
dude.
behind me.
I
Yeah,
actually am going to a costume party tomorrow night as Leonardo DiCaprio's character from One Battle After Another. So maybe I'll come dressed as a washed up revolutionary.
Folks, we'll be there. You'll be there. It's going to be great.